The wind was a blade, sharp and relentless, carving what little warmth remained from her bones. Ilara stumbled through the snow, each step a monument to an agony she had long accepted as her reality. The world had been bleached of all color, a vast, unending expanse of white that mirrored her own cursed existence. Her hair, a shock of snow white that had been the first mark against her, was plastered to her face by the blizzard's fury. Her skin, pale as milk, was turning a mottled, bruised blue in the cold. Even her wolf, a creature of moonlight and whispers, was a fragile thing, shivering within her, its spirit as thin as the worn tunic on her back. She was a curse. The Blood Moon Pack had made that clear on the day of her 18th birthday, the day of her presentation. Alpha Kalen, his eyes as hard and dark as obsidian chips, had taken one look at her and recoiled. His voice, a resonant baritone that could command warriors and soothe pups, had become a whip of scorn that flayed her open in front of the entire pack. An albino? He had sneered, the word itself a poison. A weakling. The moon goddess has cursed us with this thing. I, Kalen, Alpha of the Blood Moon Pack, reject you, Ilara, as my mate, and as a member of this pack. You are nothing. Nothing. The word had echoed in the hollows of her heart ever since. It had followed her as the pack elders, their faces grim and unforgiving, had pointed toward the treacherous Frostfang Mountains. Banishment was a death sentence, and they all knew it. No one had spoken for her. Her parents were long gone, victims of a rogue attack years ago, and she had no other family to plead her case. She had been an inconvenience, a stain on the pack's reputation for strength, and they had scrubbed her away with cruel efficiency. For 6 months she had survived. She had learned the silent language of the mountain, how to find frozen berries beneath the snow, and which caves offered the best shelter from the screaming wind. But this storm was different. It was a living entity of pure malice, a manifestation of the goddess's final judgment. Her makeshift shelter, a hollowed-out log, had been buried by an avalanche hours ago, taking with it her last scraps of dried meat and her tattered fur blanket. Now there was nowhere left to run. Her legs gave out. She fell into a deep drift, the snow a deceptively soft cradle that promised a final, cold sleep. This was it then, the end of a life that had never really begun. A tear froze on her cheek, a tiny diamond of sorrow. She had never known a kind word, a gentle touch, a moment of belonging. Her only crime was to be born as she was. Was it so wrong to wish for just one memory of warmth before she faded into the white? As consciousness began to fray at the edges, a sound cut through the howl of the wind. A snarl, low and guttural, filled with a pain so profound it resonated with her own. It was followed by a pained whimper that sounded impossibly close. Pushing herself up with arms that trembled from exhaustion, Ilara peered through the swirling snow. Not 20 feet away, a dark shape was collapsing. No, not a dark shape, several. And in their midst, a flash of white. Rogues. She could smell their foul, unkempt scent even over the storm. 3 of them, gaunt and desperate, were circling a fallen wolf. And that wolf, it was white, like her. It was enormous, a creature of myth, its fur the color of fresh cream, but it was stained crimson along its flank and shoulder. One of the rogues lunged, and the white wolf snapped, its jaws connecting with a sickening crunch. The rogue fell back, howling, but the effort cost the larger wolf dearly. It slumped to the ground, its breath coming in ragged, steaming puffs. Every instinct screamed at Ilara to stay hidden. These were desperate, starving rogues. They would kill her without a second thought. She was an Omega, the weakest of the weak. What could she possibly do? But as she looked at the magnificent creature bleeding out in the snow, she saw a reflection of herself, alone, hunted, judged for the color of its coat. She couldn't leave it. She couldn't let it die alone. A strange, cold resolve settled over her. If she was going to die tonight, it would not be while cowering in a snowbank. With a cry that was little more than a gasp of frigid air, she burst from her hiding place, grabbing a heavy, broken branch as she ran. She was a pathetic sight, a half-frozen girl in rags, brandishing a stick, but the sheer surprise of her appearance made the two remaining rogues hesitate. "Leave it alone!" she screamed, her voice thin but fierce. One of the rogues, a mangy brute with a scarred muzzle, laughed. "Look what we have here. A little snow rabbit. You'll make a fine appetizer." He took a step toward her, his yellow eyes glowing with hunger. Alara didn't think. She acted. She swung the branch with all her might, connecting with the side of the rogue's head. It wasn't a powerful blow, but it was unexpected. He staggered, shaking his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. That moment was all the white wolf needed. With a surge of incredible strength, it lunged, not at the one Alara had struck, but at the second rogue who had been flanking her. Its jaws closed around the rogue's throat, and the fight was over in a brutal final instant. The scarred rogue, seeing its packmate fall, lost its nerve. With a final snarl of hatred directed at Alara, it turned and fled into the blizzard. Silence descended, broken only by the wind and the labored breathing of the giant wolf. It tried to rise, to turn its head toward her, but collapsed again, a deep tremor running through its massive frame. Alara dropped the branch and rushed to its side. Up close, it was even more breathtaking. It was the largest wolf she had ever seen, its shoulders as broad as a man's, its fur thick and pure. Its eyes, the color of molten silver, were clouded with pain, but they were fixed on her. She saw not aggression, but a flicker of surprise, gratitude. She reached out a trembling hand, stroking the fur on its head. It was surprisingly soft. "It's okay," she whispered, her own breath catching in her throat. "You're safe now." The words were a lie. Neither of them was safe. But saying them felt important. She examined its wounds. A deep gash on its shoulder was bleeding sluggishly, the fur around it matted and dark. Another cut ran along its flank. They looked like they had been made by something laced with silver. The flesh was blackened at the edges, refusing to heal. She knew of a place. An old, abandoned hunter's cabin, barely more than a pile of rotting logs, but it had a roof and a broken door. It was a mile away, a journey that seemed impossible in her state, let alone while trying to help a creature that weighed more than 3 men. But the alternative was to lie here and freeze together. "Can you walk?" she asked the wolf, feeling foolish for speaking to see it as if it could understand. The wolf whined, a low, heartbreaking sound, and tried to push itself up, only to fall back with a groan. "No," she murmured more to herself. "Of course not." She looped her arms under its massive forelegs, trying to lever its front half off the ground. It was like trying to lift a boulder. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her vision swam with black spots. But the silver eyes of the wolf never left her face. In them, she found a strange, unfamiliar strength. Gritting her teeth, she heaved, her feet slipping in the snow. The wolf seemed to understand, pushing with its hind legs, and together they staggered forward. The journey was a blur of white agony. Every step was a battle. The wolf leaned heavily on her, its groans of pain a constant accompaniment to the wind's shriek. Alara's own body was shutting down. The cold had sunk deep into her marrow, and a dangerous numbness was spreading through her limbs. She talked to the wolf, her voice a raw whisper, telling it stories of the sun, of green grass, of anything other than the endless, biting cold. She told it her own story, of the rejection, the loneliness, the feeling of being a ghost in her own life. It felt safe to confess her deepest pains to this silent, suffering companion. By the time they reached the cabin, she was moving on pure instinct. The door had fallen off its hinges, and she had to drag it aside. Inside, it was dark and smelled of damp earth and decay, but it was blessedly out of the wind. She collapsed onto the dirt floor, the wolf slumping down beside her. For a long moment, they both lay there, gasping for breath in the frigid darkness. But she couldn't rest. The wolf's breathing was growing shallower. She fumbled in the small pouch at her belt, her fingers stiff and clumsy. All she had left was a small flint and steel, a strip of dried leather, and half a healing salve her mother had taught her to make from mountain herbs. It wasn't much. It was everything. She managed to spark a tiny flame, using splinters she tore from the cabin wall as kindling. The fire was pitiful, a flickering orange eye in the gloom, but it was life. She gently cleaned the wolf's wounds with melted snow, her touch as light as she could make it. The silver poisoning was bad. The flesh was cold and dead. Looking. Her small pot of salve wouldn't be enough, not nearly, but she applied it all, murmuring soft words of encouragement. With the last of her strength, she dragged her own thin blanket over the wolf's body. It barely covered its massive shoulders. She curled herself into a tight ball against its back, hoping her meager body heat could offer some small comfort. The wolf shifted, letting out a soft rumble that vibrated through her and draped its heavy tail over her legs. It was a gesture of protection, of shared warmth. "My name is Alara," she whispered into its fur, the words swallowed by the darkness. "I don't think I'm going to make it through the night, but I'm glad I'm not dying alone." She closed her eyes, the firelight dancing behind her lids, and finally let the exhaustion claim her. Her last conscious thought was that the wolf's silver eyes seemed to glow with an impossibly human intelligence. Ilara awoke to the sound of crunching snow. Not the whisper of flakes falling, but the heavy, rhythmic tread of many feet. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the fog of sleep. She sat up, her body screaming in protest. Every muscle was a knot of pain. The fire had died, and the gray morning light, filtering through the cracks in the walls, revealed a world still cloaked in white. The wolf was still beside her, but its breathing was steadier, deeper. The blackened edges of its wounds seemed to have receded slightly. Then she saw them. Figures, clad in armor of black steel and silver filigree, surrounding the tiny cabin. There were dozens of them, their postures rigid, their faces set like stone. They carried weapons that gleamed even in the postures. Dim light. These were not rogues. They were warriors, disciplined and deadly. A crest on their armor, a howling wolf silhouetted against a shattered moon sent a fresh wave of terror through her. The Royal Guard, the personal army of the Alpha King. What were they doing here? Panic seized her. Had she broken some unknown law? Were they here to execute her for trespassing? She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the far wall of the cabin, making herself as small as possible. The warriors didn't move. They simply stood there, a silent, menacing ring of steel. One of them, a man with a scarred face and the bearing of a commander, stepped forward. He peered into the gloom of the cabin, his eyes widening slightly as he saw the giant white wolf. Then his gaze fell on Alara, and his expression hardened. "Step away from him," he commanded, his voice a low growl. Before Alara could respond, a low rumble came from beside her. The white wolf was stirring. It lifted its head, its silver eyes clear and alert. It looked at the warriors outside, then turned its gaze to Alara, who was trembling against the wall. A soft whine escaped its throat, a sound of reassurance. Then, to her utter astonishment, it began to change. Bones cracked and shifted, fur receded into pale skin, and the lupine form elongated and reformed with a fluid grace that defied nature. Where the giant wolf had lain, a man now knelt. He was tall, even on one knee, with a breadth of shoulder that spoke of immense power. His hair was the same pure, snow-white as his wolf form, cascading over his bare shoulders, and his eyes, they were the same molten silver, intelligent and piercing. He was naked, his body a roadmap of corded muscle and old scars, but he seemed utterly unconcerned by the cold or his state of undress. He was also an albino. The commander outside dropped to one knee. "My king," he breathed, his voice filled with awe and relief. The other warriors followed suit, a wave of kneeling. Steel, king, the Alpha King, Lycaon, the Shattered Moon King, ruler of all the northern territories, a figure of legend whispered about in terrified awe. He was said to be a phantom, a warrior of unmatched ferocity, who had united dozens of warring packs under his banner. And she had saved him. She had huddled with him for warmth and confessed her miserable life story to him. The thought made her stomach clench with a new kind of fear, one that bordered on hysteria. The king ignored his men. His attention was entirely on her. He rose slowly to his feet, a warrior offering him a heavy fur cloak, which he wrapped around his waist. "You are safe," he said, his voice, a deep, resonant bass that vibrated through the very logs of the cabin. It was a voice that held the weight of mountains and the command of thunder, yet it was gentle. He took a step toward her. Alara flinched, pressing herself harder against the wall. He stopped immediately. "I will not harm you," he said, holding up a hand. "You saved my life." He gestured to the healing wounds on his shoulder and side. "Assassins. They used silver daggers. It weakened me, forced a shift. I would have died in that storm if not for you." His silver eyes scanned her, taking in her ragged clothes, her gaunt frame, the bruises the cold had left on her skin. A muscle worked in his jaw. "What is your name?" Alara," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Alara," he repeated, tasting the name. His gaze was so intense, it felt as though he were looking directly into her soul, seeing every crack and flaw, every scar left by Kalen's rejection. He took another slow step forward, and this time she didn't flinch away. There was an invisible pull, a current flowing between them, that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. He stopped an arm's length away, his eyes softening with an emotion she couldn't dare to name. "Mate," he said. The word was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a declaration that changed the very fabric of the world. The cabin fell silent. The wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Alara's mind went blank, wiped clean by that single, impossible word. Mate. The word was a fairy tale, a cruel joke. The moon goddess had already given her a mate, and he had thrown her away like trash. The bond had been severed, a ragged, weeping wound in her soul that had never healed. It couldn't happen again. It was impossible. "No," she whispered, the denial automatic, instinctual. She shook her head, her white hair flying around her face. "No, you're mistaken. I can't be." The king's expression didn't change. There was no anger, no disappointment, only a deep, unwavering certainty. "The bond is here," he said, his voice rumbling with conviction. "I felt it the moment you touched me in the snow. It hums between us now. You must feel it too." She did. Now that he had named it, she could feel it, a faint golden thread stretching from her chest to his, a fragile warmth in the frozen landscape of her heart. But it felt wrong. It felt like a trap. Hope was a more dangerous predator than any rogue. "I'm broken," she insisted, tears welling in her eyes. The shame of her past came rushing back, a toxic flood. "I was rejected. I'm a curse, an albino omega from a backwater pack. I'm worthless. You're the Alpha King. You need a strong Luna, a warrior, a noble she-wolf." Not me." The words tumbled out, a desperate confession meant to push him away, to save herself from the inevitable pain of another, greater rejection. Lycaon listened patiently, his silver eyes never leaving her face. When she fell silent, choking on a sob, he closed the remaining distance between them. He knelt before her, so that their eyes were level. The Alpha King, ruler of the North, was kneeling in the dirt before a banished Omega. The sight was so incongruous it stole her breath. "Worthless?" he murmured, his voice laced with a fury that was not directed at her. "You, who faced down 2 starving rogues with nothing but a stick to defend a stranger? You, who used your last resources, your last bit of warmth, to save a life when you yourself were on the brink of death? Elara, what you call weakness, I call the truest form of strength. What your pack called a curse." He reached out and gently touched a lock of her white hair. "I call a mark of destiny, a sigil of the moon that we share." He held her gaze, and in the depths of his silver eyes she saw not pity, but reverence. "The moon goddess does not make mistakes," he stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Your former Alpha was a fool, a blind child, who couldn't recognize the sun for its brightness. He didn't break you, he merely set you on the path that would lead you to me." His words were a balm on wounds she hadn't known were still bleeding. He wasn't just accepting her, he was venerating the very things for which she had been cast out. It was too much to process. Her mind, starved and exhausted, couldn't cope with the sudden, violent shift in her reality. Lycaon seemed to understand. He rose to his feet and turned to his waiting commander. "Gideon," he commanded, "bring the Queen's cloak." "Queen," he had said it again. The commander, Gideon, showed no surprise. He simply bowed his head and strode away, returning a moment later with a thick, impossibly soft cloak of white wolf fur, lined with silver silk and fastened with a clasp shaped like the shattered moon. It was a garment of breathtaking beauty and obvious importance. The king took the cloak and, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his immense power, draped it over Elara's trembling shoulders. The fur was warm, chasing away the last of the deep-seated chill. It smelled of pine and winter air and of him. It felt like a shield, an embrace. He then turned to face his men, who were still waiting silently outside. Elara, wrapped in the impossibly warm cloak, stood slightly behind him, feeling small and hidden. "Warriors of the Royal Guard," Lycaon's voice boomed, echoing across the snow-covered landscape. "You were searching for your king. Instead, you have found both your king and your queen." He placed a hand on Elara's shoulder, drawing her forward to stand beside him. "This is Elara, my fated mate. Your future Luna Queen. You will show her the same loyalty and respect you show me, or you will answer to me personally." There was a beat of stunned silence. Then, as one, every warrior in the clearing dropped to one knee. their fists striking their chests in a resounding salute. "Our queen!" they roared, their voices a unified chorus of fealty that shook the very air. Alara stared at the sea of kneeling warriors, at the powerful king standing beside her as if she belonged there, and felt the world tilt on its axis. Yesterday, she had been dying, alone and forgotten. Today, she was a queen. The absurdity of it all washed over her, and her vision began to swim. The ground rushed up to meet her as she crumpled, the overwhelming shock finally too much for her weakened body to bear. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground, and she was lifted into an embrace that felt as solid and unyielding as the mountain itself. The last thing she heard before darkness claimed her was the king's voice, soft and filled with concern, whispering her name. Waking up was a slow, gentle process, like surfacing from a deep, calm lake. The first thing Alara registered was the warmth. It was a profound, bone-deep heat that she hadn't felt in so long she had almost forgotten its existence. She was lying on something impossibly soft, nestled under layers of furs that felt like spun clouds. A fire crackled merrily in a large stone hearth nearby, casting a warm, flickering glow across the room. She opened her eyes. She was in a vast chamber, its walls carved from pale stone and hung with rich tapestries depicting epic hunts and starry skies. The ceiling soared high above her, supported by thick wooden beams. A set of tall, arched windows revealed a panoramic view of snow-capped peaks under a clear blue sky. This was not a cabin. It was a room fit for royalty. It was a room in the king's palace. The memories came rushing back: the blizzard, the white wolf, the warriors, the king's impossible declaration. She sat up with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. The white fur cloak was draped over a chair nearby, a stark symbol of her bewildering new reality. She was wearing a simple, soft linen nightgown that felt sinfully luxurious against her skin. "Easy," a voice said. Lycaon was sitting in a carved wooden chair near the fire, a book open in his lap. He had been watching her. He was dressed now, in a simple black tunic and trousers that did nothing to hide the powerful physique beneath. His white hair was tied back from his face, emphasizing the sharp, aristocratic lines of his cheekbones and jaw. He looked every bit the king of legend. "The pack healers said you were suffering from extreme exhaustion and exposure. She gave you a tonic. You have been asleep for a full day." He rose and came to the bedside, pouring a cup of water from a silver pitcher on a nearby table. He handed it to her, his large hand careful not to touch hers, as if he sensed she was still a frightened animal, poised to bolt. She took it, her fingers trembling, and drank deeply. The water was cool and clean, and it soothed her raw throat. Where are we?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "My citadel." "Silvercrest," he answered, his gaze soft. "It is the heart of the Northern Territories. You are safe here." Safe. The word felt foreign. She had never been safe. She looked around the room, at the opulent furnishings, the roaring fire, the powerful man standing before her. This was so far removed from her life of hardship it felt like a dream, one she was terrified to wake from, or perhaps it was a nightmare in disguise. "Why am I here?" she whispered, clutching the cup like a lifeline. Lycaon's expression was patient, as if he had expected the question. "You are here because you are my mate," he said simply. "This is your home now." "But I can't be," she protested, the old arguments rising to her lips. I'm not fit to be a queen. The people will not accept me. I'm a weak Omega, a cursed albino. My people will accept whom I tell them to accept," he stated, a hint of steel entering his voice. And you will stop calling yourself weak and cursed. It is an insult to the goddess who chose you, and it is an insult to me. He sighed, the hardness leaving his face as quickly as it had appeared. He pulled a small stool closer to the bed and sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Alara, I have been Alpha King for over a century, he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. I have waited for my mate all that time. I have met countless noble, born wolves, powerful alphas, beautiful and cunning lunas, from other packs. None of them were her. I began to believe the goddess had forgotten me, that I was destined to rule alone. Then, at my weakest moment, when I was bleeding out and freezing in a storm, she sent me you. He looked at her, and his silver eyes held a raw vulnerability that stunned her. She did not send me a warrior to fight for me. She sent me a healer to mend me. She did not send me a noble to stand beside my throne. She sent me a compassionate heart to remind me what is worth ruling for. Do you not see? Everything you think is a flaw is precisely why you are my perfect match. His words were a beautiful, seductive song, and a part of her, a foolish, starved part, wanted desperately to believe them. But the scars on her soul were deep. Kaelin's rejection had been more than just words. It had been a fundamental breaking of her spirit, a confirmation of every fear she'd ever had about herself. How could she trust this? How could she believe that the Alpha King himself would want what her own Alpha had so publicly despised? You don't know me, she said, looking down at her hands. You might feel the bond, but when you see what I truly am, you will change your mind. You will reject me, just like he did. The last words were a choked whisper. Lycaon was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was dangerously quiet. I am not him. He stood up and paced before the fire, his movements like those of a caged panther. The bond is fated, Alara, but your acceptance of it must be your choice. I will not force you. I will not drag you to a mating ceremony. I will earn your trust. I will spend every day showing you that you are valued here, that you are cherished. He turned back to her. But I will not allow you to wither away under the weight of a fool's opinion. You will eat, you will rest, and when you are stronger, you will walk these halls as my honored guest. You will see what it means to be Luna of this pack, and you will decide for yourself if this is a life you can accept. Over the next few weeks, Lycaon was true to his word. He gave her space, but he was a constant, steady presence. He would invite her to join him for meals in his private dining room, simple affairs where they spoke of trivial things. He asked her about the plants of the mountains, and he listened with genuine interest as she described the healing properties of herbs she had used to survive. He never once mentioned the mate bond, but it was a constant, humming undercurrent between them, a golden thread that grew stronger with each passing day. The palace staff treated her with a deference that left her perpetually uncomfortable. Maids brought her beautiful gowns of velvet and silk in shades of cream, silver, and winter blue. Chefs prepared meals that made her weep with their richness after a lifetime of near starvation. Guards bowed their heads as she passed, murmuring, "My Luna." At first she would flinch and try to hide, but Lycaon's quiet encouragement gave her a sliver of confidence. He took her on a tour of the citadel. It was a city in itself, carved into the mountain, a marvel of werewolf engineering. He showed her the vast libraries, the training grounds where warriors honed their skills, the greenhouses that grew food even in the depths of winter. He showed her the pack's children, running and playing in a sun-drenched courtyard, and she saw a softness in his eyes that made her heart ache. She began to see the man behind the king, She saw his dedication to his people, his sharp intelligence, his loneliness. She saw the way his guards respected not just his power, but his wisdom. And she saw the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, with a mixture of hope and longing that mirrored the growing feelings in her own chest. The ice that had encased her heart for so long was beginning to thaw. Cracks were forming, and tiny streams of warmth were seeping through. She found herself smiling, a real, genuine smile, when he told a dryly witty story. She started to look forward to their shared meals, to the sound of his deep voice. The bond was no longer a faint hum, it was a resonant chord, pulling her toward him. But fear was an old, familiar friend. The voice of Kaelin was still there, a venomous whisper in the back of her mind. You are a curse. Weak. Worthless. This is a mistake. He will realize it soon. She was terrified of letting herself feel, of opening herself up to the possibility of being hurt again. The fall from this height would be so much greater, so much more final. So she hesitated, trapped between the desolate wasteland of her past and the terrifying, beautiful promise of a future. She didn't know which one she was more afraid of. The day the delegation arrived from the Blood Moon Pack, the air itself seemed to grow heavy. Ilara was in the palace's winter garden, a magnificent glass atrium filled with hardy mountain flowers, when she heard the announcement. Lycaon's head of protocol, a stern she-wolf named Serena, was informing him that the tribute party from the south had arrived. The name of their alpha struck Ilara like a physical blow. Kaelin. Her blood ran cold. He was here, in this place, her sanctuary. The warmth she had so carefully nurtured over the past weeks vanished, replaced by the familiar, soul-deep chill of terror. Her breath hitched, and the beautiful flowers around her seemed to wilt and turn gray. She had to hide. He couldn't see her. If he saw her, he would what? Laugh at her? Drag her back? The rational part of her mind knew Lycaon would never let that happen, but the fear was not rational. It was a primal, ingrained response to her tormentor. She turned to flee, to run back to the safety of her rooms. But it was too late. The delegation was being led through the gardens on their way to the throne room, and Kaelin was at their head. He looked the same, arrogant, handsome in a cruel way, his black hair and dark eyes a stark contrast to the white stone of the palace. He walked with a swagger that broadcast his self-importance. Then he saw her. His eyes swept over her, a flicker of confusion in their depths. He saw a she-wolf with striking white hair, dressed in a gown of silver velvet that shimmered in the light. He saw the health in her cheeks, the life in her eyes that had been absent when he had cast her out. Recognition dawned, followed by a sneer of contemptuous disbelief. Well, well, Kaelin drawled, stopping his delegation. He strode toward her, his posture oozing possessive dominance. Look what crawled out of the mountains. I'm surprised the cold didn't finish you off, little curse. Ilara froze, her feet rooted to the spot. The old panic was a clawed hand squeezing her throat, stealing her voice. She felt small again, worthless, the girl in rags being judged before her pack. Playing dress-up in the king's palace? He continued, his eyes raking over her insultingly. Don't tell me you came here to beg for scraps. Your place is with your pack, to be dealt with as I see fit. You are still my Omega to dispose of. He reached out, his hand grasping for her arm. Come, you will explain yourself. Ilara flinched back violently, a small cry escaping her lips. His touch felt like a brand, searing the memory of his cruelty back into her skin. I would advise you to remove your hand, Alpha Kaelin. The voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it cut through the air like a shard of ice. Lycaon had appeared at the end of the colonnade, seemingly out of nowhere. He stood with his arms crossed, his silver eyes not angry but chillingly calm. It was a calmness that promised devastating violence. Kalen snatched his hand back as if burned. He hadn't noticed the king's approach. He straightened up, trying to recover his swagger, though a flicker of unease crossed his face. "Your Majesty," he said, inclining his head in a shallow, barely respectful bow. "I was just retrieving a stray from my pack. This Omega is a disobedient, worthless creature I banished months ago. I apologize for her presence in your beautiful home." Lycaon took a slow, deliberate step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The sheer force of his presence was suffocating, a crushing weight of power that made the air crackle. "You apologize for her presence," he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "You call her a stray, worthless." He came to stand beside Alara, placing a protective hand on the small of her back. The warmth of his touch was a grounding force, a silent anchor in the storm of her fear. "Let me tell you what I see," Lycaon said, his silver eyes boring into Kalen's. "I see a she-wolf of such profound strength and compassion that she risked her own life to save mine. I see a heart so pure the moon goddess herself chose to mark her as a gift. The gift you were too blind, too arrogant, and too stupid to recognize." Kalen paled. His eyes darted. From Lycaon to Alara and back again, confusion and dawning horror warring on his face. "A gift? Your Majesty, you don't understand. She's an albino. Her wolf is weak. She's a curse on my bloodline." "She is not a curse," Lycaon snarled, and for the first time his control slipped, revealing the raging beast beneath. "She is my mate." The word hit Kalen like a physical blow. He staggered back, his face a mask of utter shock and disbelief. The members of his delegation gasped, their eyes wide with terror, as the implication of their alpha's actions crashed down upon them. They had allowed their alpha to banish and condemn the fated mate of the Alpha King. "You threw away a diamond, convinced it was a worthless stone," Lycaon continued, his voice dropping back to that terrifying low growl. "You had the singular honor of being blessed by the goddess with a queen, and you cast her out into a blizzard to die. You are not an alpha. You are a fool." With that, Lycaon unleashed his power. It wasn't a shout or a physical attack. It was a silent, irresistible wave of pure dominance that slammed into the Blood Moon pack. Kalen cried out and fell to his knees, his hands pressed to the ground as if trying to hold himself up against a hurricane. His entire delegation collapsed with him, groveling on the pristine stone floor of the garden, whimpering in submission. "You will kneel before your queen," Lycaon commanded, his voice ringing with absolute authority. He gently guided Alara to stand in front of him. "You will look at her, and you will beg for the forgiveness you do not deserve." Kalen trembled, his head bowed. He couldn't lift his eyes. He was utterly broken, his pride and arrogance stripped away, leaving only a pathetic, terrified wolf. Watching him, something inside Alara finally let go. The fear, the shame, the years of feeling worthless, it all dissolved in the face of Lycaon's fierce, unwavering defense. He hadn't just protected her, he had validated her. He had shown her abuser for what he was, and held her up as something precious. The walls of ice that had guarded her heart for a lifetime didn't just crack. They shattered into a million pieces, washed away by a flood of overwhelming emotion. Tears streamed down her face. But for the first time in her life, they were not tears of pain or sorrow. They were tears of relief, of catharsis, of a profound, earth-shattering gratitude. She was not a curse. She was loved. She was cherished. She was a queen. Later that evening, after Kalen and his humiliated delegation had been unceremoniously dismissed from the citadel with a dire warning never to return, Alara found Lycaon standing on a balcony overlooking the moonlit mountains. The air was crisp and cold, but she felt nothing but the warmth that now bloomed permanently in her chest. She came to stand beside him, wrapped in the white fur cloak he had given her. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the stars glitter like diamond dust against black velvet. The world felt quiet, peaceful, as if it were holding its breath just for them. The constant hum of the bond between them was now a strong, steady song, a melody of belonging. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice clear and strong. He turned to look at her, his silver eyes luminous in the moonlight. "For what? Defending my mate? Protecting what is mine? It was my duty and my honor." "No," she said, shaking her head. She turned to face him fully, her gaze unwavering. "Thank you for seeing me. Not the curse, not the Omega, not the albino. Just me." The last of her fear had vanished. The whispers of Kylan's cruelty were gone, silenced forever by Lycaon's love. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that this was real, this was right. This was her destiny. "I was wrong," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "I let his poison convince me that I was unworthy. I was afraid of being hurt again. I was afraid to trust what Bond was telling me." She took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs, feeling clean and new. "I am not afraid anymore." A slow, breathtaking smile spread across Lycaon's face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy and relief, a smile that transformed his stern, kingly features into something devastatingly handsome. "Alara," he breathed, his voice filled with reverence. She reached up and cupped his face, her small hands against his strong jaw. "The bond is faded," she said, echoing his own words back to him. "But this is my choice." Her heart swelled, full to bursting with a love so powerful it felt like it could light up the entire sky. "I accept the bond, Lycaon. I choose you." He closed his eyes for a moment, a shudder running through his powerful frame. When he opened them again, they were shining with unshed tears. He lowered his head, his forehead resting against hers. "You have made me the happiest male in this world," he whispered, and then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or possession, but one of deep, soul-shaking reverence. His lips were gentle against hers, a soft promise of a lifetime of tenderness and devotion. It was a kiss that sealed every broken piece of her back together, not as she was, but as someone stronger, whole. It tasted of moonlight and safety, of pine trees and home. The bond between them flared, no longer a thread or a cord, but a brilliant, blinding torrent of golden light, of fire and magic, that bound their souls together for eternity. In that kiss, she wasn't just accepting a mate, she was finally, truly accepting herself. Their mating ceremony was held a week later, under the light of a full moon that bathed the mountain peaks in silver. It was not a grand political affair. It was an intimate gathering in the oldest part of the citadel, a sacred stone circle open to the sky, attended only by Lycaon's most trusted council and guards. Alara stood before him, not in a velvet gown, but in a simple white dress that honored the color of her fur, the color of her spirit. When Lycaon marked her, the claiming bite at the crook of her neck was not painful. It was a jolt of pure energy, a final, indelible connection that sang through her veins. She marked him in turn, and as their blood mingled, the bond settled into a state of perfect, serene completion. They were one. As Luna Queen of the Northern Territories, Alara did not forget the cold. She did not forget the hunger or the loneliness. Her past was not a shadow to be fled from, but a lesson she carried in her heart. Her reign, alongside her king, became known for its compassion. She established shelters for the packless, the exiled, and the weak. She decreed that no child would ever be judged for the color of their fur or the perceived strength of their wolf. She understood that true strength was not in dominance, but in kindness, not in cruelty, but in empathy. Her supposed weakness, her omega nature, became her greatest asset. She could soothe diplomatic tensions with a soft word where an alpha's roar would have caused a war. She could sense the pain and fear in others and knew how to heal it. She and Lycaon ruled as perfect complements: his strength and her softness, his authority and her compassion. A king and queen, united by a love forged in a blizzard and tested by fire. Sometimes, on cold winter nights, she would stand on that same balcony, her hand entwined with her mate's, and look out at the unforgiving beauty of the Frostfang Mountains. She no longer saw a prison or a grave. She saw the crucible that had shaped her, the harsh wilderness that had stripped her of everything, only to lead her to her true destiny. The rejection that was meant to be her end had been her beginning. The curse she was told she carried had turned out to be her crown. She was Alara, the White Wolf Queen, and she had finally come home.